Hi, I'm John Kiriakou, and welcome back for another episode of Deep Focus. Back in 1993, I was a relatively junior analyst at the CIA. Every morning, every organization within the CIA, whether it's a branch, a division, an office, whatever it happens to be, has a morning meeting. That's at 9 o'clock every morning. And the purpose is to go over developments that took place around the world overnight, just so you know what people are focusing on that day and what the president, vice president, and secretaries of state and defense are interested in that day. Well, on this morning in 1993, I was in my 9 o'clock morning meeting, and the secretary walked in and interrupted. She looked at me and she said, "John, General Powell's on the phone for you," referencing Colin Powell. And I said, "How does General Powell know who I am?" She said, "I don't know, but he asked for you by name." I looked at my boss. He said, "Well, what are you waiting for? Go answer the phone." So I went and I picked up my secure line and I said, "Good morning, General Powell. May I help you?" He cut right to the chase. And he said, "John, if the Iraqis were going to kill the president, who would be in charge of actually carrying out that operation?" And I said, referencing an attempt to kill former President George H.W. Bush a little bit earlier, I said, "Well, if you're talking about the attempt to kill former President Bush in Kuwait, Kuwait operations are run by the Iraqi intelligence service Basra Station. And Basra Station is headed by the head of the Iraqi intelligence service named Sabr Abdulaziz Adouri." General Powell said, "Where does he physically sit?" And I said, "In IIS headquarters in Baghdad." And he said, "Thank you," and hung up the phone. I went back into the meeting. Everybody was excited to know what it was that General Powell had said. And General Powell at the time was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So we're talking about a senior figure here. I told my colleagues what he wanted, and I went about my day. But 8 hours later, we fired 47 cruise missiles into Iraqi intelligence service headquarters. It was the middle of the night by then in Baghdad. And the only person we killed was a janitor who hadn't done anything to anybody. The next morning I came into work and I said to my boss, "I killed that janitor yesterday." And he said, "I knew you were going to say that. You didn't kill the janitor. Powell killed the janitor. You had no idea what Powell was going to do with the information." Intellectually, I knew he was right. But that has bothered me since 1993. I think about that janitor all the time. Well, just about 5 years ago, I was going through a divorce and it was difficult. And I have a friend who just happens to be a psychiatrist. We go to the same church. We're in the same men's group. We worked at the CIA together. He's a brigadier general in the Army, and he happens to be a psychiatrist rather. And he said, "Why don't you come to the office and we'll talk professionally?" I said, "I don't need a shrink." And he said, "Maybe you do, maybe you don't. Come in and talk to me." I went to talk to him, and he diagnosed me soon after that with something called moral injury. This is something that I had never heard of before, but it's a thing. And our guest today, John Acosta, is an expert in moral injury. I'm happy to welcome him here to the show. John, thanks for being with us.
Thank you, John, for having me.
John, what is moral injury? If I hadn't been diagnosed with it myself, I think I might have doubted its efficacy. Let's say, did it really exist? Apparently, it does. So, what is it?
So, from the perspective that I understand, moral injury is a betrayal of the system. Is a betrayal that our values are not in accordance with a larger system that we belong to. And how I usually frame these things is that we all belong to different systems. I'm a son, I'm a father, so I belong to my family system. I belong to my business system, the company that I run. I belong to, when I was in the military system. And all those systems have influence on who we are as human beings and how they recapture, reignite wounds that usually came from our childhood. And you can usually see that people that have a re-injuring of something that is in their psyche is originated in childhood. Not everybody that suffers from PTSD had a wounded childhood, but many of the PTSD is a re-injuring of a childhood wound. Because not everybody that goes to war, to rephrase that, not everybody that goes to war suffers from PTSD, but many of them is a re-wounding of that childhood wound. So I usually bring it back to the system of origin, where we were betrayed when we were children, and that we felt that we weren't protected, or our values were out of alignment with our systemic culture in our family.
Is there a way to treat something like this? This seems to me to be a deep wound. And I had that one meeting with my friend. He told me what his opinion was, and then I thought, oh well, I'm a grown man. I'm just going to have to deal with it. But is there a way to treat something like this?
So one of the most beautiful things that I've seen is that moral injury can come in many forms, and I think it's about the redemptive quality of healing more than anything. There's a dear friend of mine. His name is Dan Booth Cohen. I deal with a modality called family constellations, family and systemic constellations particularly. And he wrote a book called I Carry Your Heart in My Heart, Family Constellations in Prison, with people that did commit the most heinous crimes in society, but also had this returning the dignity to the perpetrator, which breaks the cycle of the victim and the perpetrator that happens in systems, that happens in generations. And this was in Bay State Prison in Massachusetts, and there were prisoners that were there that had committed the crimes, and there was also volunteers from the local community that would come in and do this work. And the information that they brought in was this was one of the most sacred spaces that had ever been to. And I was reading this book, and I was on a flight with my wife, and I'm reading the final chapters, and I'm sobbing because of how beautiful. I'm kind of covering my face with this book because I'm embarrassed right on this flight.
It's on point.
Yeah, right. But I'm sobbing of how powerful the returning the dignity to the perpetrator is, that people can be all of the above, that there is to Caesar what is Caesar and to God's what is God's, right? That people do pay a consequence, but also have this redemptive quality that if you have that assumption of responsibility, are contrite, connect again and connect with that system, that you can return the dignity to the perpetrator to ultimately break that cycle.
How is moral injury different from PTSD for the person who has it? What is the difference?
So my understanding of it is that it usually is a core wound or a core betrayal. We call it different things, and we call it PTSD, we call it a moral injury, and we have different clinical understanding of it. But I think that at the end of the day, these things are a separation from our core values of who we are as a human being. And when we do that betrayal, whether that is through external forces or through internal forces, it all creates the same emotional load that we're carrying around that affects everything else in our life.
That makes perfect sense to me. So, speaking hypothetically for any attorneys who happen to be watching, so if there's a married couple and one of the couple has an affair, the moral injury is to the other of the couple. And it doesn't have to be an injury stemming from some childhood trauma. It could be a current day trauma that goes against the moral upbringing of the person injured.
So
right?
What I see a lot in couples that are going through a relationship is there's almost a systemic pattern that is completed. And Jan Jacob Stam, in his book on systemic organizational leadership, talks about these three consciousnesses, this three consciousness: the consciousness of the individual, the consciousness of the group, and the evolutionary force. And so the consciousness on the individual is like, I know that I'm a person, right? Much like a salmon in a river. The salmon knows that it's a salmon, and knows it's in a river, and it knows it's in a school. And so the system has some effect in it, that if all the fish are going to one way, they're all going to kind of follow it. They may bump into the other fish, and they have this subconscious group understanding. But also the evolutionary force may be the depth of the river, how many rocks are in the river, if the river dries up suddenly, that has no bearing on who we are. And they're just things that happen, crises that happen externally. And our constitution of who we are as individuals, but also part of a larger group, and in the context of the evolutionary force, all have effects in things. In family systems, we see when people are going through marital problems, it's not the first time that it started in the family system. There might have been a betrayal in a previous relationship of parents on both sides. There may have been a generation that had to leave a country and had to start a new family. And so these patterns repeat systemically from one generation to another. And that that systems lead us in many ways as much as we are inside of those systems.
Before we go on to our next question, I wanted to read a message from one of our sponsors. What if one signature from President Trump could create more American millionaires than any other event in modern history? This is not a fantasy. It's happened twice. In 1934, FDR signed an executive order that revalued gold literally overnight. It transferred billions of dollars in wealth with a single stroke of the pen. President Trump has the same legal authority, and he's been hinting at using it. Here's why it matters to you. There's a massive gap between what the government says its gold is worth and what gold actually trades for today. We're talking a difference of over $1 trillion. That gap has to close eventually. When it does, gold prices could explode, but only people positioned beforehand will benefit. Central banks already see this coming. They've been buying gold at record levels for 3 years straight. I've partnered with American Alternative Assets to release a free report called The Great Gold Reset. It explains exactly what's happening and how to position your retirement before the window closes. So go to johnlovesgold.com to get your free copy. That's johnlovesgold.com or call 1-888-GOLD-053 and they'll mail one to you. We're with John Acosta talking about moral injury and PTSD. Should I have gone through therapy to try to get over this moral injury?
I know that every individual case is different, right? Everybody has their own case, and every set and setting. What I recommend for anybody is that if they're carrying something and it brings an emotional reaction that spills over into other aspects of life, that is a wound or some baggage that may have an opportunity to be let go and integrated. Much like, I volunteer with an organization called the Circle of Brotherhood down here in South Florida. And it's men that used to be the problem that are now the solution. That reintegration of that dignity creates the letting go of that baggage that you can say, I was all those things. And I did do some things, and everybody has a past and everybody has done things. It's that redemptive quality that when you integrate again, and then you're part of that returning to the alignment, that creates the where we can let that baggage go. And that's the part that I recommend to anybody. If they're carrying around something on their conscious, that's heavy on their conscious, there's a process of reconciliation that can happen. That's truly, I don't know how else to say it, but in religious terms, this profound grace that is found in that process.
So this is something that is broadly recognized, and it's something that can be treated.
Correct. Yes.
Yeah,
absolutely.
What steps would you recommend somebody take if somebody has something weighing on them? And you see it all the time. There's an old cliche: you never know what's in somebody else's heart. You never know what's on somebody else's mind. I remember my dad fell down the steps and hit his head in 2003, and the fall killed him. He lived long enough to be life flighted to a hospital in Pittsburgh. I sped to the hospital from New York City as quickly as I could. I was holding his hand. He had Parkinson's disease. I was holding his hand when his tremors just stopped. And the doctor pronounced him dead. Well, after trying to comfort my mother for a little bit, we decided to go home. We got into the elevator, and there was an elderly man and woman in the elevator. And the man looks at me and he says, "Smile. Why the long face?" And I said, "My father died 20 minutes ago, and you want me to smile?" And he just kind of put his head down and he said, sorry. So you never really know what's going on in somebody else's life. Somebody may be suffering terribly. What do you recommend that they do?
I think it goes back to that conversation of grace, right? Is to assume that positive intent that people are going through things. And the thing that I do the most is I eat my own dog food. Right, is that I am constantly working on myself to be a better father, to be a better leader, to be a better boss, to be a better coworker, because I know the influence that I have on my system, that I can say the more solid, the more aligned I am, the more I can influence my sphere from a place of integrity rather than from a place of my wound. I am a deeply wounded human being, right? I have baggage like any other, but I'm saying this from the other side of going through hell and then being on the other side of it and saying there's a place where you can find peace, where you can connect with people through your integrity, not through the wound that says I'm not good enough, I don't have enough, I wasn't seen, I'm not connected, I'm repeating a pattern out of loyalty to my family system because of this pain that I'm carrying. Because in some way we say, in order for me to belong, I need to carry this pain, I need to carry this burden in my family system. And I think this is, in social systems, one of the most dangerous things that we can do.
Right.
Humiliation is a very dangerous tinder for genocide. If you start looking at countries from a systemic perspective, you can see the patterns of woundedness that repeats. Nicholas Christakis has this study on the widower effect, that if a couple is together for a very long time, there's a social network that's around them, that if one of the partners dies, there's an increased risk within the following 2 years. I think it's 2 years to 36 months of the other partner dying, because it has a reverberation in the system. I think we're all connected in some subconscious, that second level of consciousness that we were talking about, way that we're transmitting information with each other. And that can be leveraged, and it's a vulnerability for us as a society.
John, I'd really love to hear some success stories. You're active with people who suffer from moral injury and who are able to push through it. Can you tell us a little bit about their stories?
Yeah. So working a lot with people that are with the veteran community, with people that have been incarcerated for long periods of time, and also family systems and businesses, they all have the same ingredients. We talk about when we kind of deconstruct moral injury into that betrayal, right? And if we can reconcile the early childhood betrayal, we can walk through the other pieces and then integrate the pieces that participate as a perpetrator or participated as a victim in that process. Not to say that the victim blaming, not to say the perpetrator blaming. This is beyond blame. It's simply about acknowledging and integrating those two sides of the coin.
Right. Is there a difference, I'm wondering, between people who have one sort of triggering event in life, or people who, as you said, have been incarcerated for long periods of time and maybe have, not led the kind of clean and straight life that they once hoped they would lead? Is there a difference? And is the latter tougher to get through?
So that's a great question. I think it's usually all the above with people. And that's where I go into like really understanding systems, because when we have that 1, 2, and 3 levels of consciousness, it all affects, and you can see it with different communities. A community has a pattern, and then the individuals in that community repeat those patterns on a regular basis because of that. And here's a kind of lack of a better term, that ancestral baggage that comes in, to the cultural baggage that comes into the system. And I think a system will degrade or go into connection based on the individuals have that effect on the larger system. So when people is like, yeah, fight the system, it's like we are part of that, right? That pogo quote of "we found the enemy and they is us." I love that. It's like, that's the individual that says, oh, I'm part of this system, I'm co-creating this in some way. So if I assume responsibility, I can have a direct effect on everybody else, and then move that towards connection, not towards destruction.
I'm wondering too, with that in mind, you just made me think of something. With that in mind, how therapists, religious figures always urge you to forgive the people that have wronged you. And sometimes it takes years, sometimes it even takes a lifetime. But once you forgive those people, you realize that you forgave them for yourself. You didn't forgive them for them. Half the time, they don't even care whether you forgive them or not. Is it the same thing here with moral injury, that you really have to do this for yourself, not necessarily for the other person?
I think that is the core of it. But the piece that I'll open a parentheses on is forgiveness. In forgiveness, in Western culture, we talk about forgiveness as I am doing something for you, right? So there's first a judgment, then an absolution, right? And then to say, I let go of this guilt for you. And there's a place, and in Hebrew forgiveness, there's several words of it, right? God's forgiveness, the letting go of, putting in the right place. There's all these concepts that are deeper. There are several layers deeper in forgiveness. And the forgiveness that I'm always looking to is putting things in the right place. And the putting things in the right place is like, you may have transgressed against me. I'm not going to let that happen again. But I leave the guilt with you. I am no one to forgive you.
Yeah.
To say, I leave that with you and I keep what is mine. I keep my responsibility in it and you keep yours, but it'll never happen again. That detaching of creating distance between that dynamic creates a place of alignment rather than repeating the pattern.
Getting back to some of the men that you work with, whether they are formerly incarcerated or whatever the issue happens to be, are they by and large able to achieve that sort of state of grace, that post-forgiveness state of grace that I guess we all seek?
Yes. And the work that I do is one of the components of this community. They have an incredible array of tools that are extraordinarily effective that work in different aspects of where people are. You can't come to somebody that was recently released from incarceration and be like, oh, let's do this healing work and jump into it, right? Or somebody that just was in a crisis and was in an accident go in to say, let's write your biography. It's just setting is important, right? So there is a myriad of tools that is where you are in that arc of transition and how ready you are to be able to do that. And when you go through the first processes of that Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it's like, okay, I'm safe. You're at least safe. And then from here we can evolve. But we see when things aren't necessarily effective is that we deal with level 1 and level 2, which is that safety and the belonging, but then we don't get to meaning and we don't get to alignment. And that's the deeper work that takes on follow-up work that is a little bit heavier, that takes a little bit of time for that to settle, like the family constellation work that I do.
Right. Before our next question, I want to go back to another message from our second sponsor. If there is one thing that we have learned over the past few years, it is that access to medication can change quickly depending on politics, regulation, and corporate influence. That's why it's important to have a pharmacy that focuses on access and transparency, not on bureaucracy. This is the reason why people are turning to All Family Pharmacy. Instead of scheduling doctor visits, sitting in waiting rooms, and dealing with insurance approvals, the entire process is handled online. You choose the medications you need on their website, fill out a short medical form, and a licensed doctor reviews your request. If it's appropriate, they provide the prescription. Then your order ships directly to your door. It's a simple way to keep essential medications on hand like antibiotics, antivirals, ivermectin, mebendazole, NAD+, and more than 400 other prescription medications that people rely on every day. So prepare now before you need it in the future. Visit allfamilypharmacy.com/John and use promo code John10 to save 10% on your next order. Getting back to the basics here too. How does moral injury manifest itself in someone? If you're living with someone who's suffering from moral injury, or you're friendly with someone, how can you see that they're suffering? Is it the same kind of thing as, say, depression or anxiety or PTSD for that matter?
That's a great question. And I was, as you were saying that, and I brought up this case that we were working on. So I was first introduced to this work in Romania in 2008.
Romania.
And if you know probably about the history of Romania and how much depth of the trauma and age of it, right?
I spent a great deal of time in Romania. The whole country's still traumatized from the Ceausescu regime. Yes,
absolutely. And we did a lot of work with psychologists and psychiatrists in Romania, and it was this in the Carpathian Mountains near Brasov, and where this massive former communist headquarters party, meeting area. And it was 55 Romanian psychologists and psychiatrists. And in the family systems, the Russian-Romanian War and communism would come up repeatedly. And the positions where people had to be put into to survive. And the guilt of surviving, but also the guilt of the betrayal is part of that systemic inheritance that people take in as a family. So one individual came in, and their father had been in the Russian-Romanian War and had been a hero. And so in this field of working in this workshop, there's 40 people laying down of the people that he had to be in war with, right? To kill. And that the family system was carrying that injury over generations. And once those people were reconciled in the family system to say, you also belong to my system, as much as the victims and the perpetrators belong to the system, there's this, and I can feel it now, there's this release, there's this systemic release that happens when everybody's given their place in the family system. There's no one that is excluded, and say, this is what happened. That acknowledging what is creates the reprieve and the alignment and the letting go of where that guilt comes from.
I mentioned a few minutes ago, I'm a member of a men's group. It's called the American Hellenic Educational Progressive Association. It started off as a pro-civil rights group, to almost like a militia, to protect African Americans in the southern United States. It's a Greek group formed by Greeks who had just arrived in the United States. They had escaped 450 years of Turkish slavery, Ottoman slavery, and found themselves in places like Atlanta and Birmingham and Montgomery, Alabama, and places like that. And they're seeing these black men hanging from trees, and they're thinking, what in the world is going on? So now we raise money for, college scholarships and medical research and such. But one of our members is a documentary filmmaker, and he did a film about the Greek Civil War, 1946 to 1949, that he wanted to screen for the group. So he put the film on, and we're 10 minutes into it. And one of the old men, I'm the youngest guy by 20 years. One of the old men stood up and shouted at the screen, "You communist bastards, you killed my father." And then another one jumped up and said, "You royalist scum, you killed my father." And I thought, oh my God, we had to shut it off. We couldn't screen the movie. But we're talking about something that happened, 75 years ago. And these two guys were ready to go to fisticuffs. They were so angry. Is that what I was seeing? Is that moral injury?
That is exactly, that's the heritability of the trauma that comes in the family system. That they both come from different sides of the conflict, but both carry in their DNA, both the victim and the perpetrator.
Yeah.
And, I wrote a while back on this of the influence of mice, right? The money, influence, coercion, ego.
On your Substack, by the way, I recommend people check it out.
I appreciate that. But it's when we have a moral injury, that is that's an attack vector for people, that we can say, I can leverage this have you been betrayed before? Do you feel like you're out of alignment? And these questions are probing to say, I can leverage this attack vector against people and say, you can influence people through their wound. And I think one of the most patriotic things that you can do is heal. The more we heal, the more we influence our sphere of influence to be able to heal and get that the less manipulable we get to external forces. I think it's a deeply patriotic thing that we can do. We create stability in large systems.
There is a way then to break the cycle.
Yeah, absolutely. 100%.
Okay.
Yeah. And that's my mission, is to really educate as many people as possible on the dangers of how mind viruses can go through a system, through these wounds of collective unresolved trauma.
Yeah. Right. How do we teach this at a young age? How can we teach people to be aware that the possibility of moral injury is out there, and how you can sort of protect yourself, or maybe not, if you can't protect yourself, maybe to dull the effects of it while you seek treatment?
I think one of the biggest things is to be an example. Right. And to talk about men talking about being vulnerable, men talking about the stuff that they dealt with, is to be and these voices and these conversations are the exact conversations that we need to have, to say, I'm on the other side of whatever this is. And there is light on the other side. There is solid footing on the other side. And to say, what happened to us is not our fault, but it's our responsibility to fix it, because nobody else can. It's deeply empowering. It's to say, I'm not a victim of my circumstance, and being a victim of your circumstance is a position that you can heal out of. And when you're around people and you hear them talk about, I didn't have enough. I'm not good enough. I'm not aligned. Nothing ever goes my way. You really start understanding that this is a chip that people are carrying that can be let go and can be healed. I used to be that guy. I used to be a guy that was, the world owed me something. I grew up, I'm originally from Venezuela. The world owed me something. My parents got divorced and I had a traumatic, and I can have a myriad of things that happened. I had to leave the country when Chavez came into power and all of that, everything. And I had all the excuses in the world and nothing was ever my fault. And it wasn't until I assumed that responsibility, did some heavy lifting, that I was like, oh crap, I have a broken picker. My picker's broken, right? I was picking the wrong relationships. I was picking the wrong partnerships. I was picking the wrong ways to go down. I was the common denominator of all my problems. And then when we have that conversation, say there is a place where you can not go from, not be taken by the system, but have the agency to be able to react, to address what that is, to have responsibility, the ability to respond, not to react, the ability to respond, that we can take those 3 seconds to say, this is a pattern. This is something that I've been pulled into before.
Yeah.
This is where this goes sideways usually in my life.
I used to joke that I have a tattoo on my forehead that only women can see. And it says, please cheat on me.
Mm.
And I ran with that joke for a long time until one of my best friends called me. It was the day of my second divorce. And he said, well, it's over, isn't it? And I said, yep, it's all over. Today it was over. And he said, buddy, I'm going to tell you something because I love you like a brother. Now you need to find a therapist to help you figure out why you're attracted to women who treat you like shit.
Mm.
And I realized only when the words came out of his mouth, I'm the problem.
What a beautiful friend.
I'll say.
Yeah.
I'm deeply indebted for even just that one sentence.
Mm. Mm-hmm. The courage to say that to a friend is, because that could go two ways, right? It could go like, yeah, you can go shove it where the sun don't shine, or you can say, thank you so much. I mean, that is but
it's hard, as you just said, It's hard to intellectually come to the conclusion that you're the problem. Mm. I mean, maybe not the whole problem, but you are enough of the problem that there's something you can do to fix it by fixing yourself.
And we hear this in language all the time, right? We hear these stories and these colloquialisms that we say, like, you never met a taker that didn't like a picker, that didn't like a giver, right? That you're like, the takers love givers. They're like, that's my favorite person in the world because of the boundaries that are set in that relationship dynamic. You hear it in social media, and now it's like, oh, they're a narcissist. It's like, well, why are you picking a narcissist? That dynamic is like, I was in relationships with narcissists. I was in terrible relationships until I met my wife, because I had a broken picker. I couldn't even attract the right woman into my life until I did this terrible, difficult, really taxing work that I was like, man, I got to let go of some stuff that I've been carrying for a long time. And until I was doing that, I wasn't going to attract the woman that didn't have that. And thank God that I was exposed to this work at 26 and did this incredible work in Romania.
And it was Romania that put you on this track. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Well, to go. So my mother's a retired senior foreign service officer.
Fantastic.
And she was stationed in Romania at the time. And this is kind of an odd story, but she was stationed in Romania at the time. And after my parents' divorce, she was in a relationship with a man that was killed in a car accident, head-on collision. He was visiting his daughter in Africa. This story sounds made up. But this Romanian psychologist, she was going to a psychologist to go through the grieving process. And he was like, hey, there's this man that's coming to do this trauma work that's called Family Constellations, developed by Bert Hellinger. And she was like, I'll do whatever. If you tell me to run, and these are her words, not mine, but if you tell me to run down the road naked, I'll do whatever to process through this pain. And she saw this incredibly profound methodology of dealing with trauma, and to see that things, and Mark Wolin has this book called It Didn't Start With You, that creates a really beautiful framework to say, I'm carrying something that doesn't belong to me, that's inherited from the past, that I am playing out of loyalty to my family system, these things that I'm repeating a pattern. And when you start seeing things in that framework, you start understanding the larger system and say, oh, now I have the agency to actually do something about it. And that was kind of the realization for me, is that I found out how I was participating in it. And I said that it didn't, and it wasn't a switch. I didn't suddenly say, I met my wife, my life is awesome. I got into crappy relationships with business partners that I fought with and did the stuff and had to heal my way out of as well. I had some patterns lingered on for a little while, and I'm a stubborn man, so I had to hit my head against the wall for many years. But almost 20 years later, I can say my life is significantly better because of this trauma work that I've done, and I attract people into my life that are also in that vein, and from this, not from a place that I've got the answers to say this is one methodology that's worked for me, and I think it's very powerful.
John, where can people